What Patton did when he found 38 children who had been kidnapped and given new German identities. April 1945. A large, immaculate estate stands just outside Bad Tölz, Germany. Inside, 38 young children with blonde hair and blue eyes are playing quietly in a sunlit garden, wearing clean German clothing and responding only to German names. Everything looks like a picture of peacetime order. But beneath the polished floors of this institution lies a systematic crime that has erased the families, nations, and true identities of these boys and girls. An American unit has just crossed the perimeter, and an interpreter is listening to a confession that changes everything. What General George S. Patton does when he arrives at this facility will not just punish the administrators, but physically reverse the erasure of 38 stolen lives. This is the story of how an American division uncovered a network of stolen children, and how General Patton forced their captors to face the scale of their crimes. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe. We tell the World War II stories that show what the war revealed when the walls came down. Nurse Gerda Schiller was 35 years old, a native of Stuttgart, and a staff nurse at the Bad Tölz estate. For 18 long months, she had lived inside a nightmare wrapped in pristine white linen and manicured gardens. She had watched young children arrive at the facility, terrified and weeping in languages they were forbidden to speak. She had held them as they cried themselves to sleep, calling for mothers who would never answer. Gerda had spent her nights memorizing their real names from the secret registry, knowing that if she were caught, her life would end immediately. When the order came from her superiors to burn every trace of the children's true identities, something inside her broke. She chose to risk the firing squad, pulling the most vital ledger from the furnace flames and burying it beneath the floorboards of the cellar. She stood waiting in the courtyard as the first American vehicles rolled through the front gates. SS Obersturmbannführer Erich Hoffmann was 41 years old, born in Munich, and served as the chief administrator of the regional Lebensborn program. He wore a perfectly tailored black uniform, polished leather boots that glinted in the spring sun, and an iron cross pinned neatly to his chest. To Hoffmann, the children under his care were not human beings, but raw biological material to be shaped for the future empire. He often stated that erasing an inferior culture from a child's mind was an act of scientific charity. He had personally overseen the forced reassignment of over 200 children across 3 separate facilities, enforcing absolute silence whenever a child cried out in Polish or Czech. He lived in a private wing of the estate, drinking imported wine and reviewing before and after photographs that documented the systematic destruction of each child's past life. He stood on the stone steps of the villa, entirely confident that his rank and his flawless documentation would protect him from any consequence. By April 1945, the Allied armies were pushing deep into the heart of the German homeland, uncovering the hidden machinery of a collapsing empire. The Third Reich was fracturing along every front, leaving behind broken supply lines, burning ministries, and millions of displaced people wandering through the ruins. In the chaos of the occupation, military administrators were overwhelmed by the sheer scale of human misery, often focusing entirely on clearing roads, securing fuel depots, and managing massive columns of surrendering enemy troops. Many Allied officers simply did not have the time or the training to look closely behind the walls of the institutions they passed, frequently accepting formal documentation from local officials at face value. It was remarkably easy for specialized facilities to hide their true functions under the guise of ordinary orphanages, hospitals, or refugee camps. In dozens of small towns across Bavaria, local administrators quietly burned their records, hoping the advancing columns would merely pass them by or mistake their operations for standard wartime social welfare. Many regional commanders let these well-maintained facilities slide, relieved to find any institution that appeared orderly and self-sustaining amidst the surrounding devastation. They looked at clean beds and well-fed inhabitants and moved their tanks forward, unaware of the quiet tragedies occurring just beyond the main gates. But the estate near Bad Tölz was different, because the front lines had moved too quickly for the staff to complete their final orders, and an American unit had decided to stop and ask questions. The soldiers walked past the perimeter fences, looking at the children playing quietly under the watch of the remaining German personnel. Captain Arthur Vance, 31, from Chicago, of the 12th Armored Division, stood in the central office of the Bad Tölz villa. He held a leather-bound book with trembling hands, his eyes moving between the handwritten pages and the German administrator, who sat calmly behind a wide mahogany desk. The German nurse stood by the window, her face pale but her posture resolute, having just pointed the American officer toward the floorboards where the ledger had been concealed. Captain Vance looked up from the names, his voice steady but cold. "These children are not German," he said. SS Obersturmbannführer Erich Hoffmann did not stand up, nor did he look at the book in the captain's hands. He simply reached for a silver fountain pen on his desk, aligning it precisely with the edge of his blotter before he answered. "They speak our language," Hoffmann said. "They wear our clothes. They are citizens of the Reich by every measurable standard of our laws." "The book in my hand says otherwise," Vance said, stepping closer to the desk. "This list contains original names from Krakow, Prague, and Oslo. These children were taken by force." Hoffmann let out a short, dry laugh, leaning back in his leather chair. "You understand tactical maneuvers, Captain. But you do not understand human engineering," Hoffmann said. "Those families were chaotic, broken, and racially compromised. We did not steal these children. We rescued them from inferior lives and elevated them to the highest standards of the Reich. This is kidnapping on a state scale," Vance said, slamming the ledger down onto the mahogany wood. "You erased their pasts. You burned their family records yesterday afternoon." "We streamlined their futures," Hoffmann answered, his voice rising with cold arrogance. "A child has no memory that cannot be rewritten with proper discipline. Within 6 months, they forgot their mothers. Within a year, they forgot their native tongues. They are ours now, and your paperwork cannot change the blood we have cultivated." "You forced them to forget who they were," Vance said. "We perfected them," Hoffmann replied, pointing a finger toward the window where the children played. "Look at them. They are healthy, blond, and compliant. They do not even remember the names you are holding in that book. If you take them from here, you destroy the only identity they have left. You would be the ones committing the crime." Captain Vance stared at the German administrator, realizing the absolute conviction behind the man's eyes. He saw the before and after photographs resting on a side table, showing the same faces stripped of their heritage. He knew this level of systematic malice was far beyond the scope of a standard military arrest. He picked up the hidden ledger, held it tightly against his chest, and turned toward his radio operator, who stood waiting in the hallway. "Get the 3rd Army headquarters on the line," Vance ordered. "Tell them exactly what we found." The report reached Patton within the hour. Patton's jeep pulled up to the gate, 4 stars on his helmet, ivory revolvers on his belt. The general walked in unannounced, his boots snapping against the polished stone floor of the villa. The entire room went silent as he stopped directly in front of the mahogany desk. Patton studied him. "Who ordered these records burned?" Patton asked. "The director gave the order yesterday," Hoffmann said, standing up straight but remaining calm. "It was standard procedure for closing an administrative sector." "And who saved this ledger?" Patton asked, pointing to the book Vance held. "The nurse did," Hoffmann said, glancing toward the window. "She committed an act of treason against her own government to preserve irrelevant data." "You think 38 stolen children are irrelevant data?" Patton asked. "They are German citizens now," Hoffmann answered, lifting his chin. "Their pasts no longer exist." Patton said nothing for a long moment. Then he spoke. His voice was quiet, but it carried to every corner of the room. "You sit here in your tailored black uniform, surrounded by stolen photographs, talking about human engineering as if you were adjusting a tank engine. You think because you burned the birth certificates, you successfully wiped out 4 nations from the blood of these infants. You believe your flawless paperwork makes you a scientist instead of a common thief. The reality is far simpler. You are a coward who hides behind medical terminology to steal babies from women, who screamed in languages you beat out of their offspring. You took children who were too young to fight back, gave them fake names, and told them their mothers never existed. Nurse Schiller risked a firing squad to save this single ledger because she knew that a child's right to their own name is absolute, while your empire is temporary. Now you have a choice. You will stand in that garden right now. You will look at every single one of those 38 children. And you will read their real names, their real nationalities, and their real home cities out loud from this ledger, so they can hear the truth for the first time in 18 months. Or you can refuse, and my military police will lock you in the coal cellar under this house without light, without your uniform, and without an identity until the Nuremberg tribunal comes to hang you. Decide now. Hoffman looked at the ivory revolvers, then at the ledger, and slowly stepped out from behind his mahogany desk. Hoffman marched out into the garden under the guard of 4 American soldiers, with fixed bayonets. The 38 children stopped their playing, gathering in a quiet semicircle on the grass, their small faces turning toward the administrator who had controlled their lives for 18 months. Captain Vance handed the saved ledger to the German officer, his thumb marking the first entry on the grease-stained page. Hoffman's hands shook, the crisp white paper rattling against his iron cross as he looked down at the handwriting. With a dry, cracked voice, he read the first name, calling out a Polish girl from Krakow, then a Czech boy from Prague, and then a Norwegian toddler from Oslo. As each original identity was spoken aloud into the spring air, Nurse Schiller stepped forward, gently repeating the names to the children and pointing to their chests. The boys and girls listened in silence, some blinking in confusion while others began to recognize the sounds of the native tongues they had been forced to forget. The American military police stood in a rigid perimeter, watching the absolute deflation of the administrator's confidence as he was forced to systematically dismantle his own work, name by name, city by city, until his voice broke completely in the dirt. Captain Arthur Vance returned to Chicago after the war, leaving the military in the winter of 1946 to build a quiet career in local municipal administration. He carried the heavy memory of that Bavarian garden for the rest of his life, keeping a simple personal notebook filled with the copied names of the children he had helped save from erasure. He died quietly at his family home in Illinois in 1988, surrounded by his grandchildren, who knew him only as a gentle civil servant who rarely spoke about his time in the European theater. Nurse Gerda Schiller remained at the Bad Tölz facility for several months to assist the International Red Cross team with the identification process, ensuring that the ledger data matched the remaining institutional records perfectly. She eventually returned to her native Stuttgart, where she worked in children's hospitals for 3 decades, passing away peacefully in 1974, with the knowledge that 38 families had been reconnected because of her choice. SS Obersturmbannführer Erich Hoffmann was locked in a military prison to await formal prosecution, his polished boots and tailored black uniform replaced by standard enemy prisoner garments. He was convicted of systematic kidnapping and denationalization during the subsequent military tribunals at Nuremberg in 1947, receiving a 20-year sentence that he served in Landsberg prison before his release into a completely changed Germany. General Patton kept a copy of the saved Lebensborn ledger in his personal desk drawer during his time as the military governor of Bavaria, reviewing the repatriation progress reports regularly. He noted in a private diary entry that some battles are fought for territory, but the most critical battles are fought simply to preserve the basic truth of who a person is. Some historians have argued that Patton's intervention at the Bad Tölz facility was a localized, performative act of discipline that did little to disrupt the vast, decentralized network of the Lebensborn system across Europe. They contend that the systematic tracking of thousands of displaced children required institutional administration rather than the immediate battlefield choices of a field commander. Others argue the opposite, maintaining that Patton's uncompromising refusal to accept the destruction of identities established a critical precedent for Allied intelligence and documentation teams. They believe his public, unyielding stance forced local administrators to realize that erasing records would be treated as a direct crime against existence. What is certain is that the single ledger preserved by Nurse Schiller became an essential asset for post-war rescue teams, providing the verifiable names and origin cities necessary to initiate the long process of returning stolen children to their native countries. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have done the same? Or would you have left the tracking and identification of those 38 individuals entirely to the slower channels of the international civilian bureaucracies? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories about what the war revealed when the walls came down, make sure to subscribe.